Hello and welcome to the first in what will be a series of videos looking at the origins of the Qur'an. The Qur'an is a hugely important document, but it is also fantastically difficult to read. There are several reasons for this. The Qur'an addresses complex religious ideas in a highly idiosyncratic way, and it contains many allusions to biblical and other ancient texts that may not be familiar to a modern audience. Because it was the first book to be written in Arabic, and because of the nature of Arabic as it is written and the way that the early manuscripts were written, sometimes the identification of words and even letters can be unclear. If there was one principal author to the Qur'an, which is by no means certain, his situation and his message appear to have changed very considerably during the course of the Qur'an's composition, and yet it is notoriously hard to establish a chronological order in which to place the different passages. Finally, there is no doubt that in some places an original text has been subsequently edited. Some passages may have been added to the Qur'an after the principal author's death, and we have no idea how much may have been taken out. Some people read the Qur'an and consider it to be jumbled up nonsense, and even for many pious Muslims, the meaning of some passages must be deeply mysterious. However, great progress has been made by academics in recent decades in interpreting the Qur'an, the consequences of which are barely known to the wider public. My name is Paul Ellis, and the methodology that I shall be adopting in these videos shall be to rely upon the latest academic findings and to try to build up a set of facts based upon sound evidence and clear reasoning, and which may be relied upon with a high level of certainty. Well, according to the traditional Islamic narrative, Muhammad lived from 570 to 632 and announced the Quran from 610 onwards. What I propose to demonstrate in this video is that the Quran must have been completed after the year 630. To understand how we know this requires an understanding of one of the Quran's most prominent themes, the expected imminence of the last day, when God will wrap up history and pass judgment upon his people. To understand this, we need to understand the apocalyptic genre as a whole. So it will take a bit of a long introduction, but hopefully the benefits of this will become clear by the end of this video. I ask for your patience and for you to keep the faith that everything I tell you will become relevant in the end. Well, we start our story in the 2nd century BC. Now, if one was a Jew at this time, to give a little bit of context, by this stage in the 2nd century BC, the people of Israel had been ruled over by 5 empires over the preceding 4 centuries. First, one has the Babylonian captivity, which is so important for the development of Judaism. The Babylonian Empire had been defeated by the Achaemenid Empire under Cyrus the Great, and then the Achaemenids had been defeated by Alexander the Great, who entered Jerusalem in 332 BC. On Alexander's death, his empire was divided amongst his generals. Judea was part of the portion allocated to Ptolemy and became part of the Ptolemaic Empire until 198 BC, when it was invaded by another empire established by one of Alexander's generals, the Seleucid Empire. In 167 BC, the Seleucid Emperor desecrated the Jerusalem temple by conducting a pagan sacrifice there. This provoked a Jewish rebellion led by Judas Maccabeus, and it is around this time that a scroll comes to light called, or now known as, the Book of Daniel. Daniel is in fact not the author of the scroll, so far as we know, but simply a character that appears within it, being famously cast into a den of lions only to emerge unscathed due to his faith in God. Well, in the course of the Book of Daniel, the anonymous prophet describes several visions as he experiences them, or as they are explained to him by the angel Gabriel. It is worth stopping and pausing and noting that this is in fact very similar to the Qur'an, which also has an anonymous prophet. Muhammad wasn't his real name, that was a title. We'll come on to that in a future video. And which also cites the angel Gabriel as being the source of his information. Also the angel Michael appears in the book of Daniel and also in the Qur'an. So these are just some of several parallels between the two. The scroll itself purports to have been written 4 centuries before it was discovered during the Babylonian captivity. From this perspective, it predicts, in inverted commas, the sequence of empires that we now know were to rule over Judea. In one place, these are described as parts of a statue that comes crumbling down. In another, they are 4 beasts emerging from the sea. The age of empires, it prophesies, would culminate in the arrival of a figure it describes as one like the Son of Man. The Son of Man smites the beasts, symbolizing that he will bring the age of human empires to an end and bring about God's righteous rule upon the earth. Well, as it happened, the Maccabean rebellion was a great success, and for the first time in 400 years, Israel was an independent Jewish kingdom. However, the Son of Man did not arise, and history did not come to an end. So this would have left Hebrews wondering what was the meaning of this scroll, what value the angel Gabriel's prophecies had. Had it been misinterpreted? Is it possible that there was still one empire still to come before the end of days? Well, those who thought this would have been greatly strengthened when a further empire did arise. In 38 BC, Judea fell under the control of the Roman Empire, who initially ruled it through a proxy king, Herod the Great. We know from the Dead Sea Scrolls, which were discovered in the 1940s, that a Jewish sect called the Essenes were taking a great interest in the prophecies recorded in the book of Daniel. One scroll in particular, called the War Scroll, tells us that the Essenes believed that the Roman Empire was the final empire that had been predicted by Daniel. The scroll also tells us that the Essenes were not simply sitting there reading and writing scrolls and making predictions, but they were amassing weapons, ready to rise up against the Romans at the moment that the Son of Man would appear. At the start of the 1st century, the Roman Empire started to govern Judea directly, and it is into this highly charged, religiously and politically fraught environment that Jesus was born. It is often thought that Jesus might have had some connection with the Essenes, since some of the language that Jesus uses in the Gospels also appear in the Essene scrolls. In the Gospels, Jesus refers to himself many times as the Son of Man, the phrase that had been first used in the book of Daniel. He also preached that the kingdom of God is at hand. However, unlike the Essenes, Jesus preached a message of peace and universal compassion, saying that his kingdom was not of this world, and that those who lived by the sword would die by the sword. Nevertheless, after Jesus' crucifixion and reports that he had risen from the grave, expectations that the end of the day, the end of the world would soon occur, must have been very high. We know that between 66 and 73 AD, the Jews rebelled against Roman rule. However, unlike the Maccabeans, this rebellion was crushed and the Jerusalem temple was destroyed, further heightening expectations among some religious Jews that the Messiah must surely arise any time to rescue his people. Several apocalypses were written at around this time, of which by far the most famous is the book of Revelation, the last book of the Bible. Well, in the book of Revelation, the four beasts of Daniel are presented as one, the beast of the Apocalypse, which now serves Satan. It famously foretells a great battle to occur at Armageddon between Babylon, using the language, of course, of the book of Daniel, although actually meaning Rome, and Jesus, who it anticipates will return to Earth leading an army of warrior angels. Jesus will imprison Satan after the Battle of Armageddon for 1,000 years. After this time, Satan will be released to wreak havoc on the earth once again. But here there is a curious element. When Satan is to be released from his 1,000-year captivity, also released at the same time will be Gog and Magog. Now, Gog and Magog first appear in the book of Ezekiel. By this stage, I think it's generally accepted that the two names are used together as a general term to describe savage barbarians, in the same way that one might refer to Sodom and Gomorrah to collectively refer to moral depravity. But who were Gog and Magog? If Gog and Magog were to be released 1,000 years after the Battle of Armageddon, it raises the question, where are they now? Where are they going to be released from? How do they ever come to be incarcerated in the first place? Perfectly reasonable questions. Well, at the end of the 1st century, in a book, The Antiquities of the Jews, by Flavius Josephus, who is a Jewish historian, this book records a legend that Gog and Magog were two tribes that had been imprisoned centuries earlier by Alexander the Great. They were in a valley, and Alexander had built a huge wall across the valley, and they were unable to break through it, and so they were imprisoned behind there. This seems to have been a satisfactory explanation in the 1st century. Now, moving on, in the 4th century, the Emperor Constantine converted to Christianity, or at the very least, he ended any persecution of Christians and gave Christianity a favoured status within his empire. And Christianity soon became the official religion of the Roman Empire, which changed its capital from Rome to Constantinople and thereafter becomes known as Byzantium. This is obviously good news for Christianity. However, it poses a certain problem in terms with all these earlier apocalypses, the book of Daniel, the book of Revelation, and other Christian and Jewish texts. All of these had foretold the end of days in terms of salvation of the righteous from an evil empire. The empire concerned might have been the Babylonian Empire in the book of Daniel, or the Seleucid Empire at the time of the Maccabeans, or the Roman Empire by the time of the book of Revelation. However, the religious message had always remained essentially the same. A Messiah would arise who would free the righteous from an evil empire. But Christianity was now the official religion of the world's most powerful empire. It made no sense for the church to tell people that they were to pray for deliverance from a Christian empire. The apocalypses needed to be, or the apocalyptic vision needed to be changed somewhat to fit the new circumstances. And the solution was found in a new apocalypse, one that's very little known today, called the Tiburtine Sibyl. And this would be the first pro-imperial apocalypse. Now, the Tiburtine Sibyl was supposedly an ancient soothsayer that had been consulted by the Emperor Augustus and had predicted to him the birth of Jesus. Well, during the course of the 4th century, a version of the legend came into circulation in which the Sibyl also predicted a heroic last emperor. According to the Sibyl, the last emperor would do various tasks, would perform various tasks, including he would defeat Gog and Magog. He would convert the Jews to Christianity. And when he had defeated Gog and Magog and converted the Jews, he would then go to Jerusalem and personally hand over his crown to Jesus upon Jesus' return. Well, this brings us finally to the time of Muhammad. Now, to understand the time of Muhammad, we need to understand the Byzantine-Sassanian War that raged between 602 and 628. The very years during which, according to the traditional Islamic narrative, the Qur'an was being announced. The conflict between Rome and Persia is sometimes said to have been the longest conflict in human history. By this stage, it was into its 7th century. This would be its final showdown, and is often called the last great war of antiquity. Well, it begins in 602, when a Byzantine general, Phocas, deposes and kills the former emperor Maurice. The Sassanian king, that's a Persian king, Khusro II, who had had a very good relationship with Maurice, as we will see, invaded the Byzantine Empire, ostensibly to avenge his friend's death and murder. In 610, Phocas was overthrown by Heraclius. However, Heraclius came in too late to rescue the position in his eastern territories. The Sassanian Empire ended up seizing the whole of Byzantine territories in the Middle East, in North Africa, and parts of Anatolia. They even besieged Constantinople at one stage. However, some years later, in 622, Heraclius staged a dramatic counterattack, sometimes regarded as one of the greatest military recoveries in history, and he invaded Iran. By 628, he was able to besiege the Iranian capital, Ctesiphon, and force the deposition of Khusro, and the Sassanians had to promise to return all the territory that they had seized from him in the previous 30 years. Now, an important aspect of this is that during the war, some Jews in the Byzantine Empire had sided with the Sassanians. After all, they had been persecuted under first of all under the Roman Empire, and then as the Roman Empire had become Christian Byzantium, things hadn't really improved for them. They'd just been persecuted by the Christians. So many had favoured the Sassanian Empire, and at one stage some in Jerusalem had staged an uprising. As he regained his lost territory, Heraclius ordered all the Jews in the Byzantine Empire to either convert to Christianity or to leave his empire. So in 628, as Heraclius was at the peak of his powers, speculation began to circulate that he may be the fabled last emperor that had been predicted by the Tiburtine Sibyl. After all, the last emperor had been due to repel an invasion by Gog and Magog. Well, Heraclius had his empire invaded by a pagan, Khusro II, and he had repelled this in spectacular fashion. He was also due to convert the Jews. Well, because the Jews had rebelled, then Heraclius had ordered their conversion, or their departure, their exclusion from the empire. So he could regard this as having been satisfied too. This left one more condition. The emperor, the last emperor, had to offer his crown to Jesus at Jerusalem. But during the course of the war, when Khusro II had captured Jerusalem, he had seized the relic of the one true cross. Naturally, when Heraclius was setting terms for the peace treaty, he had insisted upon the return of this, which was granted, and in spring of 630, Heraclius entered Jerusalem in triumph, bearing the relic of the cross upon which Jesus had been crucified. Now at this stage, speculation was extremely high that this could be the apocalypse, this could be the moment that the Tiburtine Sibyl had predicted. Now, two books that celebrate Heraclius' victory by presenting him as the last emperor and his victory as being the dawn of a period of righteous rule prior to the apocalypse are The Glorious Deeds of Alexander and The History of Maurice by Theophylact Simocato. And both of these books can be demonstrated to have directly influenced passages of the Qur'an. The Glorious Deeds of Alexander influenced the story of Dhul-Qarnayn in Sura 18, and the passage from the History of Maurice is reflected in the opening verses of Surah 30. Let's start with the Glorious Deeds of Alexander. The Glorious Deeds of Alexander tells a legend of Alexander the Great in three parts. The third part is an allegory of the Byzantine-Sassanian War, in which Alexander plays a role of Heraclius and a Persian emperor, Tubarak, acts out the role of Khusro. But it's a clear allegory of the events of the war that was actually fought in the 7th century, or actually appear as though as part of a legendary war fought centuries earlier. The second part tells of a fantastic journey by Alexander based upon the legend that had been recorded by Flavius Josephus back in the 1st century. During this journey, Alexander travels to the ends of the earth, visiting the land where the sun rises and the land where the sun sets. He built a wall of iron and bronze across a valley to protect a tribe from the raids by Gog and Magog. And he makes a prediction that when Gog and Magog break through his wall, this will signal the end of the world. Well, if one is familiar with the story of Dhul-Qarnayn in the Qur'an, then this will all look very familiar to you. In Surah 18, the Qur'an tells the story of Dhul-Qarnayn, which means the man with two horns. Like Alexander, Dhul-Qarnayn travels to the ends of the earth, visiting the land where the sun rises and the land where the sun sets. Like Alexander, he builds a wall of iron and bronze across a valley to protect a tribe from raids by, in the Qur'an, Yajuj and Majuj. And like Alexander, he predicts that when Yajuj and Majuj break through the wall, this will signify the end of the world. Clearly, these two stories are extremely similar. If you would like to know more about their similarities, I highly recommend a document, the paper you can find online. If you Google for the Alexander legend in the Qur'an, 18.83-102 by Kevin Van Bladel. It's freely available on the www.academia.edu website. I highly recommend it. It's a very good paper showing out the comparisons between Glorious Deeds of Alexander and the story of Dhul-Qarnayn in more detail than I can here. Stephen Shoemaker has described the similarity between the two stories as a smoking gun, demonstrating the Qur'an's reliance on Byzantine eschatology. In his book, The Apocalypse of Empire, Imperial Eschatology in Late Antiquity and Early Islam, Stephen Shoemaker writes, "The fact that we can demonstrate the direct influence on the Syriac Alexander legend on the traditions of the Qur'an leaves little doubt that Muhammad's new religious movement was aware of and in contact with the imperial eschatology of Christian late antiquity. The patterns of agreement between the legend and Qur'an 18.83-102 make any explanation other than direct influence highly improbable. Accordingly, the legend provides, as it were, a very important smoking gun, indicating a direct connection between late ancient imperial eschatology and formative Islam. So Heraclius uses the story of Alexander the Great as an allegory for himself to give religious significance to his victory and in particular to his reconquest of Jerusalem. He's putting himself in the footsteps of Alexander the Great. The Qur'an then adopts the structure of the story of Alexander the Great for its story of Dul-Qarnayn. Now the name Dul-Qarnayn, as I mentioned, means the two-horned one. Now Alexander the Great was often depicted as having two horns. This is, I believe, to do with him having been recognised as a god in Egypt, and the god he was recognised as had two horns. So you see on the screen there a medallion of Alexander with horns on the side of his head. However, Alexander was not the only person who had two horns in antiquity. Moses is also often depicted with two horns. Here you see a picture of a statue, I think it's by Michelangelo, of Moses with two horns. Apparently this is due to a mistranslation of the Vulgate Bible by St. Jerome. Moses comes down from Mount Sinai with rays coming out of his head, and this is translated as horns coming out of his head, and so the image seems to have stuck, become very popular with artists. So, is the figure, the mysterious two-horned one, used in the Quran, trying to equate Alexander the Great with Moses? Well, if you think that the two horns is not sufficient to demonstrate this, there is a much stronger similarity or equation of Moses with Alexander the Great, again in Sura 18, the same Surah as contains the story of Dul-Qarnayn, but about 20 verses earlier. And this is the story of Moses and the fish. Now it's worth reading these 5 verses in full. So this is Surah 18, verses 60 through to 64. And when Moses said unto his servant, I shall continue on till I reach the junction of the 2 seas, even if I journey for a long time. Then, when they reached the junction of the 2, they forgot their fish, and it made its way to the sea, burrowing away. Then, when they had passed beyond, he said to his servant, Bring us our meal. We have certainly met with weariness on this journey of ours. He said, Didst thou see? When we took refuge at the rock, indeed I forgot the fish, and naught made me neglect to mention it save Satan, and it made its way to the sea in a wondrous manner. He said, That is what we were seeking. And so they turned back, retracing their steps. Now for the last 14 centuries, Muslims must have read these 5 verses and been somewhat puzzled what they mean and what on earth it's doing in the Quran, what message they are supposed to take from it. By far from obvious what the meaning of this passage is. However, its meaning is very clear to anyone who is familiar with a different legend of Alexander the Great. This is the Alexander romance of Pseudo-Callisthenes. This was written in round about the 3rd century BC, so long before the days of Heraclius. And it appears in the references to this story appear in the Babylonian Talmud, in the tractate called Tamid, and it is also referred to in the homilies of Jacob of Suru. Now, Jacob of Suru was a Christian preacher and writer of homilies, and we know that the Quran author was familiar with his work because Jacob of Suru wrote an account of the 7 sleepers of Ephesus, which is very similar to the Quran's story of the sleepers of the cave, again as it happens in Surah 18. Now, in the Alexander romance of Pseudo-Callisthenes, Alexander, accompanied only by his cook Andreas, is travelling, seeking the font of immortality. One day, Andreas, his cook, is washing a dried fish in a stream when it comes to life, wriggles from his hand and swims away. In his unsuccessful attempt to recapture it, Andreas falls into the stream himself. Andreas does not mention the incident to Alexander straight away. When he does, Alexander realizes that the stream was in fact the font of immortality that he had been searching for. The two of them retrace their steps, but they cannot find it. Andreas, as a result, gains eternal youth, and his master, Alexander, does not. Now, when we see this story, then suddenly these passages of the Qur'an between 1860 to 64 suddenly make sense. We can observe the parallels between the two. Both involve two travellers, a master and his servant. In one case, Alexander and Andreas, in the other, Moses and an unnamed servant. In both cases, a fish is being prepared as a meal. In both stories, the fish comes to life and escapes. A further similarity is that the servant fails to immediately mention this to his master. In the Quran, this is attributed to Satan. And finally, when the servant does mention it to his master, the two of them retrace their steps. Now, the story of Alexander and the fish is clearly a religious allegory. The font of immortality represents salvation by God using the image of baptism. The person who is immersed in water gets eternal life. That's not too difficult to work out. Andreas is saved, but his master is not, which adopts the biblical theme of salvation for the servant, salvation through humility and selfless service, rather than being a great and exalted person on earth. However, the Quran omits the crucial detail of the servant falling into the water. The Quran makes no reference to the servant gaining anything or falling into the water, and so in the Quran the story loses its original meaning. So, what is its purpose? Is this an example of the Quran author simply telling a garbled tale with no meaning or significance to it? Not at all. I believe that the only purpose of the story's inclusion is to associate Moses with Alexander in the minds of the audience a few verses before the Quran then goes on to tell the story of Dhul-Qarnayn, the two-horned one. Once one recognises that Dhul-Qarnayn actually adopts the story of Alexander the Great, but gives it a religious complexion by suggesting that it is in fact Moses who is Dhul-Qarnayn and not Alexander. And what does the Quran author do this for? What is his benefit? Well, the Quran author in many verses represents himself as a new Moses. He presents himself as a prophet, the man who talks to God, as a scribe, the deliverer of a new holy book, as the giver of laws, as a nation founder, and a military and political leader. So, through the figure of Dhul-Qarnayn, and assuming that his audience is familiar with the glorious deeds of Alexander and the meaning of this, the Quran author adopts the Byzantine imperial propaganda, namely that Heraclius is a predicted last emperor whose victory over the Sassanians is the sign of the end of days. And the Quran author, by conflating himself with Moses and Moses with Alexander, eventually associates himself with the lead role in these dramatic events. Remember that the essential message of the Qur'an, one of the essential messages of the Qur'an, is the imminence of the apocalypse, which is mentioned very many times in the early Qur'an. And so the fact that the imperial propaganda of Heraclius is also predicting the imminence of the end of the days would have been very useful and very helpful to the Qur'an author, if only he could interpose himself in the lead position. That is what he does through the story of Dhul-Qarnayn. Moving on to the second book. This is the history of Maurice by Theophylact Simocato. Remember that Maurice had been the emperor who had been deposed and murdered by Phocas in 602, and that this had been the ostensible cause of the war between the Byzantine Empire and the Sassanian Empire, the last great war of antiquity. Now, the relationship between Maurice and Khusro had been very good. The Sassanian King of Kings had once been sheltered by Maurice at his court, and Maurice had helped Khusro to gain the Sassanian throne. And as I mentioned, Khusro had cited the avenging of the slaying of Maurice as his justification for starting the war. Well, in the history of Maurice, there is a scene in which Khusro, whilst he was a guest of Maurice at the Byzantine court, foretells the future war and the course that it would take. He says, addressing some other people in the Byzantine court, "Be assured that troubles will flow back in turn against you Romans. The Babylonian race will hold the Roman state in its power for a threefold cyclic hebdomad of years." That's a little bit of a mouthful. A hebdomad of years is 7 years, and a threefold cycle will be 3 lots of 7 years, so that is 21 years. Thereafter, you Romans will enslave Persians for a 5th hebdomad of years. When these very things have been accomplished, the day without evening will dwell amongst mortals, and the expected fate will achieve power, when the forces of destruction will be handed over to dissolution, and those of the better life will hold sway. Well, I hope to persuade you that these words influence the Qur'an, Surah 30, verses 2 to 7, although the parallels, I accept, are not as obvious as with the Alexander legends and Moses and the fish and the story of Dhul-Qarnayn. To go through these verses, Surah 30, verse 2 to 7, the Romans have been defeated in a land nearby. Yet after being defeated, they will prevail within a few years. Unto God belongs the affair before and after. And on that day, the believers shall rejoice in God's help. He helps whomsoever he will, and he is the mighty, the merciful. This is God's promise. God fails not his promise, but most of mankind know not. They know some outward aspect of the life of this world, but of the hereafter they are heedless. Now, to work out the parallels between this passage from the history of Maurice and Surah 30, one has to go through it quite carefully. Both passages involve an early defeat for Rome in a military confrontation. So Maurice says, the Babylonian race will hold the Roman state in its power. Verse 2, the Romans have been defeated. Both passages say that Rome will recover from this and will ultimately triumph. Thereafter, you Romans will enslave the Persians. Yet, after being defeated, they will prevail. And both refer to a period of years. In the case of the history of Maurice, there is a specific period fixed, 21 years. The Qur'an is a little bit vaguer, just says within a few years. The key to the passage is this fourth section. which will usher in the end of days and God's righteous rule on the earth. In the Qur'an, this idea of the end of days is communicated by three fairly innocuous words: on that day. Now, most people reading the Qur'an would interpret these as meaning on the day that the Romans will be victorious. Yet after being defeated, they will prevail within a few years, and on that day the believers shall rejoice. And many scholars over the years, or over the centuries, have wondered why it would be that the Qur'an's community would rejoice in a Byzantine victory, since it doesn't seem to favour them at all. However, the phrase "on that day" has a very specific meaning within the Qur'an. And that meaning is on the last day. If you read it once within a verse like Sura 30 verse 4, it's not by no means obvious that it has a special meaning. But if you look at it across the Qur'an, it definitely does. The phrase "on that day," or a phrase very similar to it, is in fact used over 70 times within the Qur'an to refer to the last day. And sometimes this is repeated in close succession in order to stress this special meaning. So, for example, if we take Surah 25, between verses 22 and 27, let us have a look. On the day they see the angels, there shall be no glad tidings for the guilty that day. And they will say, a barrier forbidden. And we shall turn to whatever work they had done and make it scattered dust. That day the inhabitants of the garden shall have the best dwelling place and the most beautiful rest. And the day when the heavens are split open with clouds and the angels are sent down in a descent, that day the true sovereignty will belong to the compassionate, and that will be a difficult day for the believers. And that day the wrongdoer will bite his hands, saying, would that I had taken away with the messenger. So you see, on the day, on that day, that day, and the day, that will be a difficult day, and that day. The constant repetition gives the phrase "on that day" a very specific meaning. Another example comes in Surah 69, verses 15 and 18. On that day the event shall befall, the sky shall be rent asunder, for that day it shall be frail. And the angels shall be at its sides that day, 8 shall carry the throne of thy Lord above them. That day you shall be exposed, no secret of yours shall be hidden. I think the point is now fairly clearly made. Even in Surah 30, the very surah that we are looking at, the phrase "on that day" or something similar appears 3 more times in 2 separate places. In Surah 43, in verse 43, it says, and set thy face to the upright religion, before there comes a day from God that none can repel. That day they will be spread asunder. And later, in verse 57, on that day the excuses of those who do wrong will benefit them not, nor can they make amends. So once one can decode "on that day" as meaning on the last day, it now becomes clear that the reason that the believers are rejoicing in the Byzantine victory or the Roman victory is not because they're having a street party because they were supporting the Byzantines. Not at all. It is because this is a sign of the last day. And this, of course, is exactly what Khusro predicts in the history of Maurice. With Surah 30, as with Surah 18, the Qur'an is adopting Heraclius's post-victory propaganda that his victory is a portent of the last day, which of course is a theme that is very helpful to the Qur'an author, since this is what he was predicting from the very earliest verses of the Qur'an. If you would like to know a little bit more about this, there's a second reference, second bit of further reading for you if you look for Q30:2-5 in Near Eastern Context by Adam Silverstein, again, it's on the www.academia.edu website. Again, I highly recommend it as a read that will make this all clear, probably clearer than I can explain it here. So, to summarise, the traditional life of Muhammad has him announcing the Qur'an at around the same time that the Byzantine-Sassanian War is being fought. At the end of the Byzantine-Sassanian War in 628, or probably after 630, which is when Heraclius enters Jerusalem, 2 books are produced: the Glorious Deeds of Alexander, influencing Sura 18, the History of Maurice, which is then used as an inspiration for Sura 30. Heraclius' victory was only certain from 628. He entered Jerusalem in spring of 630, so I don't think it is realistic to think that these books could have been produced before then. Since these books influenced the Quran, we can now reach our first conclusion in this series of videos, and that conclusion is that the Quran must have been completed after 630. On the one hand, I want to apologise that it's taken quite a long time to reach somewhere that's a fairly short and fairly basic conclusion. On the other hand, I hope that hope you've enjoyed listening and that you've learned something about the sophistication and the layers of meaning that are in the Quran, and which has to understand in order to make sense of this vitally important document. Well, please consider liking this video if you did like it. Please consider subscribing. I plan on making a few. Comment. I'd love to hear from you. Keep it civil. Share it to anyone you think may possibly be interested, and follow me on Twitter at IslamResearchGP, and all these slides will be screenshotted and published on that Twitter feed. So thank you very much for watching, and I hope you join me in my next video, in which I shall be addressing when the Quran must have been completed before, and which will then help us to establish a window, as it happens, quite a narrow window, within which the Quran reached its final form.